Mr. Prabhu, Jamshed, Arnab, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for asking me to this event to celebrate the second anniversary of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. I think it's clear from the audience that you've gathered here that in 2 years you have carved out a very distinct and niche for yourself by taking an integrated approach to issues which are becoming more and more important to all of us. It's quite remarkable what you've done in such a short span of time. I first became aware of what you were doing when you did the report on global India and global governance, which set out an agenda for India on most of the issues of global concern, which was, I think, unique work. I don't think anyone had done that before. And it has, since I noticed, which is the ultimate flattery, spawned imitators. So that, I think, is proof of how good your work is. But today, what I thought I would do, since I know very little, some of you who know me know this, know very little about water, energy, resources. What I thought I'd do was to talk about energy and resources in national security. Not as a lecture, despite what it says there, but just to leave some ideas with you and to see then what we think of it. I think in the past, clearly, nobody thought that energy, resources, water had major national security implications. And the security calculus used to be dominated by military hard power considerations. But clearly, today, that's no longer so. Today, it's almost a truism. Everybody accepts that each of these, energy, water, all of them, resources, all affect national security. And there's a simple reason for that. If you look at it over history, I mean, the ability of military power to shape the economic environment, which for millennia we actually took for granted, is steadily declining. And that's a fact. I mean, in jargon, people like to say geoeconomics has taken over, is controlling geopolitics, rather than the other way around. But I think most people would agree today that in an interdependent international economic world, the international economic and political influence, and not just military capability, becomes a much more significant factor and a much more significant indicator and provider of national security. Unlike the Cold War years, today this globalized interdependent world has only one economic system, and all the significant actors, I mean, it doesn't matter whether it's China, India, Brazil, all of us, we all compete in the same space, in the same world economic system for energy, for resources, for the sources of wealth and security. But I think the corollaries of this shift are less well understood. Geopolitically speaking, if you had to rank the instruments of state power in sort of usability, nuclear weapons superiority is the least usable. The next most unusable is probably military superiority. And it's the economic and political levers which are the most usable levers of power today in this world. The result is a turn to non-military weapons, levers, and things like, social media, cyberspace, pipelines, economic sanctions, energy, etc., become means for individuals, states, groups to try and achieve their security goals. And this is a profound shift. This is actually pretty basic to the way we do our business. We've seen just recently how the power of rumor, amplified by the social media, by the internet, by ICT, can move tens and thousands of our countrymen to leave their places of stay, of work, and flee. I mean, we've seen the power of these instruments today. And that has clear security implications. This is not a world that I think we've either thought through or understood yet. And my point is only that we need to change, therefore, the way in which we not just look at security. We all accept that the definition of security has changed, but at what the instruments and levers and what the factors of security are today. So this is why I think what you intend to do, and your future work especially on resources, efficiency, and security, is particularly significant in this context, because it comes in a profoundly changed context in which we are operating today. And you see this in each field. You look at energy security, for instance. In the last 2 years, we've seen in West Asia and the Middle East how shifts in energy availability and markets have profound geopolitical consequences. In the last decade, there's been a considerable shift in the energy balance in the world, with new sources of fossil energy, whether shale oil, new oil and gas fields, changing the geographical distribution and the pattern of supply and demand and the old equilibrium that we were used to. To some extent, this remarkable growth in supply of oil and natural gas has been masked by high oil prices, which in itself is a consequence of equally dramatic changes in the pattern of demand. I mean, some of it I think we are responsible too, but also a phenomenal growth in oil and gas futures trading and hedging. I mean, that has been in the last decade. So when we look at our energy security today, for instance, supply is abundant, but risk and vulnerability is also much higher than it's ever been before. We have a very different paradigm to deal with. But what does this mean in geopolitical terms? It's interesting. In 2011, I think the US obtained less than 10% of her oil imports from the Middle East. Some people say that by 2016 this could be down to zero. New technologies and discoveries are said to make the US self-sufficient in LNG for the next 100 years. So the fundamental assumption that many of us have made was that the West would stabilize the Middle East and ensure a flow of cheap oil, which was essential to all these economies. But I don't think we can make that assumption anymore. The Middle East now accounts for less than 16% of global recoverable reserves. And the new fields are in new places, in Brazil, in North America, Central Asia, other locations outside the Middle East. So, in some senses, people can actually afford the turmoil that we see in the Middle East. People can actually afford regime change. Now, these are immediate security consequences of a shift. So there are geopolitical consequences to what we see happening in what traditionally we only regarded as an energy market. And we looked at it purely as and that's a big shift. And that's the kind of shift that, frankly, I think there's similar and significant shifts also occurring to a greater or lesser degree in other resources. I mean, whether you look at coal, at iron ore, copper, rare earths, certainly you've just seen all of which I think you will be studying as you go forward in your work. Now, I don't want to just frighten you and say all this has very negative consequences, it should be frightening us. Same shifts mean huge opportunities for us, but you need to be quick, you need to understand them, and you need to deal with them very differently from the traditional ways in which we are used to dealing with them. And that's why I think what you do here, this integrated approach, looking across the board, trying to, and the studies that you're planning to do, I think that's why I think they're so important. I have one thought, though, which I think is politically very incorrect, and I don't think anybody here will support me. I personally think that water is in a category by itself. That, there's a lot of talk of water wars and water as a security issue. Maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to be that most of our planet's surface is water. So if it's an availability issue, it's really an energy issue. It's the energy you need for desalination. That it's not a water issue. I don't know of a single war over water in history. I don't think that's ever happened, even though we keep frightening ourselves about this. But also it's the nature. I mean, there are specific limited military uses of water in some locations, perhaps. But I think we overestimate the security implications of water issues. Water issues are issues. They're serious issues. They're issues of life and death, but they're not issues in the sense that energy and so on have been, not security issues in the sense that, but as I know this is politically incorrect, and to say to you is probably the worst thing to do. But I'd be very happy to be proved wrong and to be shown how we should deal with it. One last point. The geopolitical impact of energy and resource issues also has significant implications for global governance and for governance within countries. But we're in uncharted waters here. Oil and gas resources have been the subject of international contention long enough that, you know, most states have understood their significance and have some idea of how to relate to the private players, the individuals, the firms, and so on, who play a major role in their exploitation, exploration, etc. But this is not true for the other resources. When you look at things, as I said, coal, iron ore, rare earths, and so on. And nor is it likely that the power to allocate these resources, both globally and within states, is going to be given up very easily by the small groups who actually control them today. And that's the potential source of trouble, as far as I can see. We are wrestling with some of these issues every day in India. You see it in the media as well. But this is despite the fact that when you take the larger view, energy, several resources of strategic significance, even cyberspace itself, could be considered global public goods in the real sense of the word. But existing global governance regimes and even market mechanisms for these goods no longer cope with the situation that we have. We've seen this. You look at food security and food commodity prices and what's been happening over the last 5-6 years and the security implications of that. So we need to adapt them, and the more work you can do on that kind of interface, I think the more useful it would be. So my apologies for inflicting a random set of thoughts and a whole set of demands of what we would like to see from you. Probably irrelevant, then ignore them. But if not, what I would like to really urge you to do is to regard energy, resource security, not only as a question of efficient and assured access and distribution and supply, but in the larger sense of their impact on the security of states, peoples, and individuals. Thank you, and thank you for being so patient with me. Thanks.